All right. Well, before we just dive into the issues, Congresswoman, for anyone who's been tuning out all of the ads and who doesn't know exactly who you or your opponent are, can you give us the briefest stump speech as to why voters should elect you to the Senate?
Sure. I'm Elissa Slotkin. I represent Michigan's 7th district, so Lansing area, third generation Michigander. My whole life has been in national security. I'm a former CIA officer, Pentagon official, 3 tours in Iraq alongside the military. Now I'm running for the U.S. Senate. And my whole sun and my moon is just that we need a strong and growing middle class in Michigan, in the country. I think it's existential. So whether it's bringing supply chains home, good jobs, better jobs with dignity, and bringing down major costs, that's what I wake up and think about, what I go to sleep thinking about, and what I want to do in the U.S. Senate.
All right, and you and your opponent both bring a lot of experience, strong national security credentials to the table. What would you say is the greatest threat facing the U.S. right now?
Well, I think it's honestly great power competition, and in particular, the military threat and the economic threat from China. I think that it's a different type of threat, but because we depend on them. We have a globalized economy, but whether it's their military advantages that they have in some cases, or it's the way that they have just dominated our supply chains and have a veto on our economic security, to me, it's really important on a bipartisan basis for us to come up with thoughtful plans on how to make sure we're prepared militarily, God forbid, if we need it, but also, just as importantly, that we take a really serious approach to China investing in things like our farmland, our manufacturing facilities. I've written legislation to say we shouldn't be able to do that. They shouldn't be able to do that without actually a real national security vetting. So that's what I think is a particular threat to the country.
Yeah. Is there a policy priority on China that you would be pushing if elected as soon as you got to the Senate floor?
Absolutely. I'm on the Armed Services Committee in Congress right now, and it's actually one of the most bipartisan issues I work on, which is good, right? We should have partisanship end at the water's edge. And for me, just as a national security person by training, a CIA officer, I think about the world in terms of what could harm our citizens. That's the mission, is to keep people safe. So for me, there's no doubt about it. I have been very focused on it in my time in Congress. I would continue to be in the Senate.
Sure. Let's talk about Gaza. Would you say that you are in lockstep with the Biden administration as far as its stance has been on the war that's over a year into the making now?
Yeah, I mean, I think I take an independently minded approach on this. And as someone who served 3 tours in Iraq alongside our military in places like Anbar province and Ramadi, and I watched the United States at war. I think we just had the 1-year anniversary of the attacks in Israel by Hamas. People were raped. People were taken hostage. It traumatized the society. And in the year afterwards, it is just been kind of a personal connection to everyone from the Detroit area, whether you're Arab or Muslim American, Jewish American, students. It's roiling our state. For me, I do think we need a negotiated ceasefire. We need those hostages home. We need to move on from this phase of the conflict. But I think we all know with what's going on in Lebanon and now Iran firing at Israel, ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, we're just in a very different phase. And I'm more concerned right now with the spread of this conflict into something that looks more like a regional war, which of course we don't want.
Yeah, as those conflicts continue to grow and the ceasefire negotiations have just been fruitless, if this continues, if you're elected and months from now we're still at the same point, do you think it'll be time to consider a change in policy?
Well, look, I think in general, wars end in 2 ways across history. Either one side definitively wins or both sides get exhausted. Now you have multiple sides in this conflict. You have what's going on in Gaza. You have what's going on in Lebanon. You have what's going on in Iran. And I hope we get to the point where leadership on all sides of this actually want to negotiate in good faith on behalf of the people. That's been hard to do over the past year. But I think that most normal people do not want prolonged war. They want to live in security and dignity. I still believe a 2-state solution is the only viable way to long-term security in that region, even if it feels very far off from right now.
Yeah. Obviously, it's been a big story in Michigan that a lot of Arab American voters, a lot of people in Michigan have become pretty disillusioned with the Democratic Party. What would you say to those voters who are part of the uncommitted movement?
Yeah, well, I was glad to see that Vice President Harris has made a point to meet with the leaders when she's flown into when she's flown into Detroit, and had the opportunity to have those private conversations without the media there. I know some have come out of that and then turned around and endorsed her. Look, I think it's been a very painful year for everybody. And people, the hardest thing about this conflict is whether you're talking to Arab and Muslim Americans, Jewish Americans, there's almost the same mirror image experience going on, right? You have leaders who are saying, I feel like other Americans don't care about my dead, people who look like me and look like my children. Yeah. I'm scared about the rise of Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. I don't know what's going to happen to my kids at college. There's a lot of stress in the system right now. And so people are very raw about it on all sides of this conflict. And what I would say very clearly is I personally don't think things get better on any of these conflicts, this or anything else, certainly abroad, if we return the former president to the top of the ticket, or to the White House, excuse me. So I know it's painful. It's been a really, really tough year for everybody. But to me, it's about being practical and about what's the best for our kids and our grandkids.
Okay. Another huge issue in this state, in this race, electric vehicles. You've made it clear that you say you don't support any effort to force people to buy them, but of course the latest standards would require automakers to sell a certain number of them. Do you believe EVs are the future? Is it even a possibility at this point to consider anything else?
Yeah, I really don't care what people drive. I live on a dirt road. I live on a farm. An electric vehicle is not possible for me at this point. But I know who I want to make those vehicles. And while we may not drive the lion's share of them in this state, go look at places like Europe. Go look at places like South America. China is eating our lunch in those markets. I mean, just absolutely dominating. And I'm not willing to cede that next generation of vehicles to China. And Michiganders know we've often missed trends here in the United States before they've come. Remember, in the 70s and 80s, we built a lot of big cars here in Detroit. And when those little fuel-efficient vehicles came in, the Toyotas and all that, we kind of poo-pooed it. We said, well, no one's really going to want those little vehicles. And then the Japanese came in and ate our lunch. And then the Koreans came in and ate our lunch. So for me, I just don't want to make that same mistake of missing that trend. I do not care what people drive, but I want to make them.
So if we're already behind, how do we make up for that ground that's already been lost? And how fast does that need to happen?
Well, look, this is exactly what we've been trying to do since basically COVID. Right? COVID, I think everybody had their sort of come to Jesus moment and realized that our supply chains on a lot of things were way overextended into China. China had basically a kind of veto on our economic security here. Everything from chips to masks to pharmaceuticals to key pieces in our cars. And so we, I think in a very bipartisan way, have been focusing on supply chains and making sure critical items are made, at least in part, in the United States. The CHIPS Act, so that we actually have our own chip facilities. We invented chips in the United States, and we make 0% of the chips that go in cars. That makes no sense to me. So for me, it is literally about saying, hey, are we just going to give up, throw up our hands and say, oh, China has it? Or are we going to actually compete and have policy and industrial policy that brings some of that manufacturing home? And I know which side I'm on. I want Team America. I want Team Michigan building that stuff. I'm not going to just give up.
Okay, let's move on to reproductive rights. Obviously, Michigan voters protected them in this state 2 years ago. What do you think needs to happen next, if anything, at the federal level?
Well, look, I was against overturning Roe v. Wade, and I think we need a law in front of the Senate that would codify Roe v. Wade so that every state in the country, women had access to abortion care when they needed it, right? I can't stand this idea that if, one of my friends who happens to be pregnant wants to drive to Chicago and God forbid had an incident in Indiana, right? She has different rights when she crosses over that border than when she's in Michigan. That doesn't make any sense. Our kids want to go to school somewhere. They want to go to a conference somewhere. Your rights shouldn't just be attached to the soil that you're standing on. So I just think this is a federal issue. It should be a federal issue. I think control of the Senate is really going to decide whether we're going to codify Roe v. Wade for everyone in the country, or as some are proposing, we have a national ban on abortion. This is not settled at the national issue. And Michiganders did great work. I voted for Proposition 3. But that doesn't mean we're safe when we cross over to another state. And it doesn't mean we're safe from the constant legislation. So many bills, so many restrictions, so many bans that are being proposed every single month that will come to the floor of the Senate one way or another.
Yeah, I spoke with your opponent recently about this, and he said that Michigan has made its choice on this, and he wouldn't vote in any way to change those laws in a way that would affect Michiganders. In your first debate, you accused him of being disingenuous about that. How so?
Well, look, I mean, past behavior is the best indicator of future behavior. He was an elected official for 20 years. There was never a single bill, restriction, or ban on abortion that he did not vote for. He has a 100% record. He considered himself proudly a defender of a ban on abortion for 30 years. And now, because he's put his finger in the wind and he thinks that he needs to look better on this issue, he's changing his tune in the last final months. He voted 56 times to restrict or ban abortion. People tell you who they are with their votes. And I just have to say, if you believe that he will protect your rights, I got a bridge I want to sell you, because it just is not borne out in the facts.
All right. Before we have to let you go, let's talk about your ability to work across the aisle. For the voters who are sick of the gridlock and the dysfunction in Washington, D.C., how can they have their trust in you to not be part of that problem, but part of the solution?
Right. Well, look, I got elected as a Democrat who won in a Trump voting district. Right. It's a very purple place, the place I've been representing for 6 years. That means most of my mayors and town supervisors are all Republican. Most of my small communities are all Republican. So I couldn't go a week without working on a bipartisan basis. I think that's how our country is supposed to run. Two healthy parties pushing and pulling on each other. And my record bears that out, right? I was voted the 14th most bipartisan out of 435 members of Congress. I will have been open about the fact that I don't always vote in lockstep with my party. More than 97% of the rest of my party, I'm willing to vote across the aisle. I believe in bipartisan legislation. It's always better when it's bipartisan. But I think more importantly than all of that is, I'm like a lot of Michiganders. I grew up in a mixed household. My dad was a lifelong Republican, my mom a lifelong Democrat. That's how we used to be here in Michigan. So the idea that I would just be so partisan that I couldn't have Thanksgiving dinner with my dad just doesn't work for me. National security, we're just not trained that way. So for me, I put my money where my mouth is, and everyone, Republicans, independents, Democrats, always have an open door in my office.
All right, and I know we have to wrap up here, but briefly, is there a specific decision that you've made which you have broken with your party that you can point to, and how you came to that decision?
Oh, sure. I mean, I'll just take one that's hyper-local. Right now, our farmers, particularly small and medium-sized farmers, are really having a hard time staying afloat. The math is not working for a lot of our small farmers. Think blueberries, cherries, apples, asparagus, those kinds of things. And they've been mandated wage increases for their folks year after year after year that just don't make it work. The math is not working. And so I'm one of, I think, 3 Democrats in the entire Congress who signed on to legislation here by Representative Molinar that would put a freeze so our farmers can stay afloat. I got a lot of pressure from the Democratic side of the aisle on that issue. There are very few of us who are willing to stick our necks out and do that. But the logic here is that our farmers need to survive. That's the first order of business. And I'm not afraid to make those decisions when the facts are there.
All right, Congresswoman, thanks so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.